Think about the best memories of an American childhood in the 20th century. The freedom of the open neighborhood, the wind in your face, the heavy steel frame beneath you that felt completely indestructible. For over 80 years, one name defined that exact feeling. This company did not just manufacture toys. They built an absolute monopoly that commanded the loyalty of millions. They were so powerful, they dictated terms to the entire retail industry. But power breeds blindness. Walk past the site of their legendary Chicago headquarters today, and you will not hear the roar of stamping presses or the hiss of welding torches. You will only find silence. The greatest bicycle manufacturer in history surrendered its crown, handed its blueprints to a foreign factory, and watched helplessly as its own student strangled it into bankruptcy. How does an empire that survived the Great Depression willingly execute its own legacy? Chapter 1. The Origins of an American Dream. The late 19th century in America was a time of endless mechanical promise. It was an era defined by smoke, steel, and a relentless drive toward motion. For a young mechanical engineer named Ignaz Schwinn, this environment was exactly what he had been searching for. Born in Germany, Schwinn had spent his early years studying engineering and working on the latest two-wheeled contraptions in Europe. But he knew that the true industrial frontier was across the Atlantic. In 1891, he packed his bags and emigrated to the United States, bringing with him a deep understanding of bicycle mechanics and a quiet but fierce ambition. He eventually made his way to Chicago, a city that was rapidly becoming the manufacturing heart of the nation. It was a place where raw materials flowed in by rail and finished goods shipped out to every corner of the country. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition had just showcased the wonders of modern technology to the masses, creating an atmosphere of electric possibility throughout the city. By the time Schwinn settled in Chicago, the United States was in the absolute grip of the great bicycle craze of the 1890s. The invention of the safety bicycle, featuring two wheels of equal size and a chain drive, had transformed riding from a dangerous circus act into a practical mode of transportation. Everyone wanted a bicycle. Hundreds of small manufacturers sprang up overnight to meet the explosive demand. In 1895, Ignaz Schwinn found a financial backer in Adolf Arnold, a successful meatpacker who recognized the young engineer's technical brilliance. Together, they founded Arnold, Schwinn, and Company. Their timing seemed perfect, and their early models were praised for their racing geometry and superior build quality. Schwinn was an obsessive perfectionist who demanded precision on the factory floor, ensuring that every weld and bearing met his exacting standards. His workers were pushed hard to maintain strict tolerances, a practice that set their products apart from cheaply assembled competitors. For a few brief years, the company rode the crest of the bicycle wave, turning a handsome profit and establishing a reputation for excellence among adult riders and professional racers. However, the good times were incredibly fragile. As the new century dawned, a much louder and more powerful machine began rolling out of workshops in Detroit and beyond. The automobile arrived, and it completely shattered the bicycle industry. Motorized vehicles captured the imagination and the wallets of adult Americans, offering speed and status that no pedal-powered machine could match. Almost overnight, the bicycle went from being a symbol of modern freedom to an outdated novelty. Demand plummeted, and the hundreds of bike manufacturers that had crowded the market began to collapse one by one. Bankruptcies swept through the industry like a plague, leaving empty factories scattered across the Midwest. Arnold, Schwinn, and Company found itself staring into the abyss. Adolf Arnold eventually saw the writing on the wall and sold his share of the business to his partner, leaving Ignaz Schwinn alone to steer a sinking ship through a devastated economic landscape. Faced with total ruin, Ignaz Schwinn had to make a survival decision. If adults were no longer going to buy bicycles, he needed a completely new market. He looked at the cultural landscape and realized that while grown men wanted cars, children still dreamed of mobility. Before this realization, bicycles were built almost exclusively for adults, sized and priced entirely out of reach for the average child. Schwinn decided to pivot the entire operation. He ordered his engineers to redesign their frames, making them smaller, sturdier, and more affordable. He shifted the marketing focus from sophisticated adult transportation to the ultimate childhood toy. This was a massive gamble. The company was betting its remaining capital on the idea that parents would spend their hard-earned money on a recreational item for their children. The pivot ultimately saved the company. By treating the bicycle not as a shrinking adult market, but as a growing youth market, Schwinn found a lifeline. The strategy required durable construction because children were incredibly tough on their possessions. Schwinn reinforced the frames and utilized stronger components, creating a product that could survive neighborhood races, jumps, and being dropped repeatedly on the pavement. This commitment to durability slowly built a new kind of brand loyalty. Parents knew that a Schwinn would last, perhaps even long enough to be passed down to a younger sibling. By refusing to surrender to the automobile and choosing instead to conquer the youth market, Ignaz Schwinn pulled his factory back from the brink. He laid the firm foundation for an empire that would soon define the American childhood experience. The company had survived its first great trial, but the true test of their manufacturing dominance was still decades away, waiting in the shadows of the Great Depression. Chapter 2. Surviving the Great Depression. October 1929 brought an economic catastrophe that shattered the United States. The stock market crash wiped out fortunes overnight, and the ensuing Great Depression suffocated American manufacturing. The bicycle industry, which had already spent the last 2 decades bleeding market share to the automobile, now faced absolute annihilation. In Chicago, factory after factory locked their doors as the rust settled in. Arnold, Schwinn and Company watched its orders evaporate into thin air. Ignaz Schwinn, the brilliant founder who had guided the company through its early trials, was now aging. The monumental burden of saving the family empire fell squarely onto the shoulders of his son, Frank W. Schwinn, universally known as FW. He inherited a massive brick factory running on fumes, filled with a workforce terrified of joining the endless breadlines forming across the city. By 1931, the situation had grown desperate. Families were struggling to put food on the table, making the purchase of a bicycle seem like an absurd, impossible luxury. The standard bicycles of the era were not helping the cause. They were built with thin, high-pressure tires that resulted in a harsh ride. They were fragile, prone to frequent flats, and easily bent on the unpaved, rutted roads of American neighborhoods. FW knew that trying to sell the same fragile product in a shattered economy was a guaranteed path to bankruptcy. Desperate for a lifeline, he traveled to Europe in search of any technical innovation that could spark consumer interest. While observing the rough, cobblestone streets of Germany, he noticed riders using a completely different type of equipment. Instead of thin rubber, European bikes utilized wide, low-pressure tires. They absorbed the violent shocks of the uneven roads effortlessly, providing a smooth and highly durable ride. FW immediately recognized that these balloon tires could revolutionize the American bicycle industry. He returned to Chicago and began pitching the idea to domestic rubber manufacturers. Most executives thought he was completely insane for wanting to invest heavily in a child's toy during the worst depression in modern history. However, through sheer force of will, FW finally convinced a supplier to produce a heavy-duty 2.125-inch tire. But FW understood that slapping a new tire onto an old, tired frame would not save the company. He needed to build a completely new vehicle. He needed a product that captured the imagination of a deeply depressed nation. He looked away from traditional bicycles and focused on what truly fascinated young boys: the booming aviation industry, streamlined Art Deco locomotives, and roaring motorcycles. In 1934, Schwinn unveiled the Aerocycle, and it changed the industry forever. It was a masterpiece of industrial design that abandoned the traditional delicate diamond frame. Instead, the Aerocycle featured sweeping, aerodynamic lines constructed from heavy-gauge steel tubing. FW added heavy fenders, a battery-powered headlight, a loud horn, and a simulated gas tank built directly into the frame. It did not look like a bicycle at all. It looked exactly like a miniature motorcycle. This was a brilliant, calculated psychological strategy. During the bleakest years of the Depression, parents felt immense guilt over the poverty they were forcing their children to endure. The Aerocycle offered an emotional escape. It was heavily chromed, painted in vibrant two-tone colors, and built like a tank. Riding one made a poor kid in a dusty neighborhood feel like a king. Purchasing an Aerocycle required a massive financial sacrifice for an average family, but parents figured out a way to make it happen. It was a one-time investment that promised years of absolute durability. The reinforced steel frame and the thick balloon tires meant the bike rarely broke, saving families precious money on constant repairs. The strategy worked flawlessly. While rival manufacturers closed their doors and liquidated their equipment, the Schwinn factory in Chicago roared back to life. Assembly lines that had sat dormant for years were suddenly running full shifts to meet the overwhelming demand. By refusing to compromise on design and understanding the deep emotional needs of his customers, F.W. Schwinn did the impossible. He guided the family business through the darkest economic disaster in American history, turning a moment of near death into the foundation for total market dominance. Chapter 3: The Post-War Monopoly. When World War II ended, the American economy transitioned from a wartime footing into an era of explosive consumer growth. The GI Bill helped millions of returning soldiers purchase homes, leading to the rapid creation of the American suburbs. These new neighborhoods featured paved sidewalks, expansive driveways, and long, quiet streets. It was an environment perfectly engineered for raising children, and consequently, it was the ideal landscape for the bicycle industry. F.W. Schwinn emerged from the wartime production years with a significant advantage. The Chicago factory was highly efficient, the brand name was deeply trusted, and the newly established middle class had money to spend. However, F.W. did not simply want to participate in this economic boom, he intended to dominate it completely. To capture the imagination of this new suburban generation, the company introduced a product that would become a manufacturing legend. In 1949, the Black Phantom rolled off the assembly line. It was an incredibly heavy, luxurious, and wildly overbuilt machine. It featured a genuine leather saddle, a gleaming chrome tank, a patented spring fork suspension, and a built-in electric headlight. The Black Phantom was far more than a simple mode of transportation. It was a visible status symbol for a young boy. It carried a premium price tag, costing significantly more than the generic bicycles sold in hardware stores or mail-order catalogs. Yet the quality was entirely undeniable. The company backed these heavy steel cruisers with a lifetime guarantee on the frame. This was a level of confidence completely unheard of in the toy or recreation market at the time. Parents justified the high cost because the bicycles were practically indestructible, while children demanded them because they mirrored the powerful motorcycles their fathers admired. Producing a superior product was only one component of the master plan. The true genius of the empire during the 1950s was how it seized control of the retail experience. F.W. Schwinn harbored a deep resentment for department stores. He watched as massive retailers treated his carefully engineered bicycles like cheap commodities. They assembled them poorly in back rooms, stored them haphazardly, and offered absolutely no mechanical service after the sale. FW realized that a broken bicycle reflected poorly on the manufacturer, not the department store. His solution was both ruthless and highly effective. He systematically cut ties with mass retailers and implemented the authorized dealer network. This program completely revolutionized how bicycles were sold in the United States. The authorized network operated under strict, uncompromising rules. To earn the right to display the company logo, a shop owner had to agree to a rigid set of conditions. They were forbidden from selling rival brands that directly competed with premium models. They were required to maintain a clean, brightly lit showroom. Most importantly, they had to employ certified mechanics who knew how to assemble, tune, and repair the bicycles according to factory specifications. In exchange for this absolute loyalty, the manufacturer granted these dealers regional exclusivity. If you owned the authorized shop in a specific town, no competitor within a certain radius could sell a new model. This strategic move created a perfectly closed ecosystem. Customers who wanted the highest quality bicycle on the market had no choice but to walk into an authorized independent shop. They paid full retail price, because discounting was strictly forbidden by the factory. This arrangement turned a manufacturing company into a national distribution monopoly. By the late 1950s, the Chicago executives dictated terms to everyone in their orbit. If a supplier wanted their parts used on the assembly line, they accepted the pricing offered to them. If a local retailer wanted to sell the most popular consumer product in America, they bowed to the corporate rules. The factory hummed with absolute authority, producing hundreds of thousands of units a year. They had built an impenetrable fortress of quality, distribution, and brand loyalty. At that moment, it seemed entirely impossible that anyone could ever threaten their absolute grip on the market. Chapter 4. A Pop Culture Phenomenon. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, American youth culture began to shift. The heavy, tank-like cruisers that had defined the post-war era were starting to look outdated to a new generation. In Southern California, a distinct subculture was emerging. Teenagers were obsessed with custom car culture, drag racing, and chopper motorcycles. They started modifying their standard bicycles to reflect this rebellion. They removed the heavy fenders, attached long polo seats, and bolted on radically high handlebars. A Schwinn engineer named Al Fritz traveled to California and noticed these strange, heavily customized creations roaming the streets. He recognized immediately that these kids were not just modifying bicycles. They were creating a completely new category of youth transportation. Fritz returned to the Chicago headquarters with a radical proposal. He wanted to mass-produce a factory version of these California chopper bikes. The older executives were deeply skeptical. To the traditional bicycle craftsmen at Schwinn, the proposed design looked absolutely ridiculous. It featured a small 20-inch frame, a sweeping banana seat that allowed the rider to sit far back over the rear wheel, and tall ape-hanger handlebars that forced the rider's arms up high. It defied every conventional rule of bicycle geometry and ergonomics. Despite the heavy resistance from his superiors, Fritz managed to build a prototype. He believed in the concept so strongly that he convinced the board to produce a limited run. In 1963, Schwinn officially launched the Stingray. The response was not a gradual success. It was an absolute explosion. The Stingray hit the American market with the force of a cultural earthquake. Children did not simply want one. They begged, pleaded, and worked odd jobs for months just to afford it. Dealerships could not keep them on the showroom floor. The moment a truck unloaded a shipment of Stingrays at an authorized shop, the inventory vanished. The design resonated because it gave kids the attitude of a motorcycle outlaw combined with the freedom of a bicycle. It allowed them to do wheelies, slide through dirt corners, and ride in a completely new, aggressive posture. By 1964, the Chicago factory was running at maximum capacity just to keep up with the insatiable demand. The company capitalized on this frenzy by expanding the line into highly specialized, wildly colorful variants. They introduced the Crate series, featuring names like the Orange Crate, the Apple Crate, and the Lemon Peeler. These top-tier models took the chopper aesthetic to the absolute extreme. They came equipped with a small 16-inch front wheel, a fat rear slick tire, heavy-duty suspension springs, and a mechanical stick shift mounted directly to the top tube. It was a dangerous, thrilling, and incredibly beautiful machine. Schwinn was no longer just building bicycles. They were manufacturing the defining artifact of an American childhood. The brand embedded itself into the cultural DNA of the 1960s and 1970s. The scale of production required to feed this frenzy transformed the Chicago facilities into a sprawling industrial behemoth. The main plant was a deafening labyrinth of stamping presses, welding stations, and massive paint ovens. Thousands of workers stood shoulder to shoulder across 3 shifts, turning raw steel tubing into painted, polished consumer gold. The logistics network operated with military precision, loading rail cars and freight trucks around the clock. Every authorized dealer across the country relied entirely on the Chicago headquarters to survive. If a local shop owner complained about a late shipment or questioned a corporate policy, Schwinn could simply revoke their franchise and give it to a competitor across the street. The power dynamic was entirely one-sided. This total market capture created a fatal sense of invulnerability in the boardroom. The executives, led by the 3rd generation of the Schwinn family, looked at their balance sheets and saw only endless growth. At the peak of the Stingray craze, the statistics defied belief. Out of every 4 bicycles sold in the United States, 1 carried the Schwinn head badge. They were the architects of a monopoly, protected by a deeply loyal customer base. They believed they dictated American tastes rather than reacting to them. The phenomenal run of the Stingray convinced the leadership that they had unlocked the final formula for bicycle manufacturing. They stopped looking at the horizon. They stopped listening to the strange new requests coming from older riders and serious cyclists. Surrounded by the deafening success of their own making, the leaders of America's greatest bicycle company slowly became deaf to the changing world outside their walls. Chapter 5. Cracks in the Fortress. The dominance Schwinn achieved in the 1960s was intoxicating, but it masked a critical vulnerability. As the decade turned into the 1970s, the children who had grown up riding the Stingray became young adults. They did not stop riding bicycles, but their demands changed entirely. The United States entered an unprecedented period known as the bike boom. Environmental awareness was rising, physical fitness became a national obsession, and the oil crisis made alternative transportation highly attractive. Suddenly, adults were buying bicycles in record numbers. They did not want heavy, single-speed cruisers or children's novelty bikes. They wanted sophisticated, lightweight 10-speed bicycles capable of covering long distances with minimal effort. This sudden shift in consumer appetite exposed the fundamental weakness in the Chicago factory's rigid manufacturing philosophy. For decades, the company had built its reputation on absolute durability. Their signature production method was a proprietary electroforging process. This technique welded heavy steel tubes together into an incredibly strong, seamless frame. It was perfect for children who routinely dropped their bikes on the pavement. However, it was completely wrong for the emerging adult market. A standard Schwinn 10-speed, like the Varsity or Continental, weighed nearly 40 pounds. They were nearly indestructible, but they were exhausting to pedal uphill. Meanwhile, manufacturers in Europe and Japan were using a different construction method. They built frames using thinner steel tubes connected by cast metal lugs, which were then brazed together. This process resulted in bicycles that were significantly lighter, more responsive, and far more enjoyable for adults to ride. As the 10-speed craze swept the nation, European brands began flooding the American market. Soon after, Japanese manufacturers arrived with precision-engineered, lightweight bicycles that offered superior components at highly competitive prices. The American consumer noticed the difference immediately. The authorized dealers felt completely trapped. Their strict contracts forbade them from selling competing brands, meaning they had to watch helplessly as potential customers walked out the door and went down the street to buy a lightweight French or Japanese 10-speed. The executives in Chicago recognized the threat, but they were physically trapped by their own success. The massive factory complex that had produced millions of bicycles was entirely calibrated for electroforging heavy carbon steel. It was a highly specialized, incredibly expensive infrastructure. Retooling the plant to produce lugged frames or to handle emerging modern materials like aluminum alloys would require a staggering financial investment and massive factory downtime. The leadership, now largely isolated from the changing realities of the street-level market, balked at the cost and the disruption. They chose a path of least resistance instead. Rather than modernizing their domestic manufacturing capabilities to meet the new standard, they decided to import lightweight bicycles from Japan and place their own historic decals on the frames. They partnered with Asian builders to supply their lightweight model lines, effectively admitting that they could no longer manufacture the high-performance bicycles their adult customers actually wanted. This decision was a fundamental turning point in the history of the company. For the first time, the greatest bicycle manufacturer in America was actively relying on foreign competitors to fill the crucial gaps in its product line. The brick walls of the century-old Chicago plant were metaphorically cracking. The company was losing its core identity as a master builder and slowly transitioning into a mere marketing and distribution firm. The dealers, who had sworn absolute loyalty to the brand, were becoming deeply frustrated by the lack of competitive, domestically produced lightweight models. The corporate executives assumed that the famous brand name alone would carry them through this challenging transition period. They stubbornly believed the adult 10-speed trend might simply be a passing fad, just like so many other cycling trends before it. This dangerous combination of industrial paralysis and corporate arrogance set the stage for a catastrophic internal collapse. While management focused on maintaining their heavy steel production lines and patching the market holes with imported frames, they completely ignored the growing tension within their own workforce. The factory floor, once the proud, beating engine of the empire, was about to become a bitter battleground. Chapter 6: The Arrogance of the Elite. The twilight of the 1970s brought more than just shifting consumer tastes to the great bicycle empire. While the company desperately tried to patch the holes in its product line with imported 10-speed frames, a much deeper rot was taking hold inside the corporate headquarters. In 1979, the leadership of the century-old company formally passed to the fourth generation of the founding family. Edward Schwinn, Jr. took the helm as president. Unlike his great-grandfather Ignaz, who was a brilliant engineer obsessed with mechanical perfection, or his grandfather F.W., who understood the emotional desires of the American public, Edward Jr. was a modern corporate executive. He viewed the bicycle business through the cold lens of margins, spreadsheets, and union busting. He inherited a company that was financially strained by its own reluctance to modernize, and his chosen method for fixing the balance sheet was to squeeze the very people who built the product. The primary target of this new corporate austerity was the historic Chicago manufacturing complex. The factory was a sprawling, multi-story brick behemoth that had operated continuously for decades. It was undeniably outdated and inefficient by modern manufacturing standards. Moving raw steel and finished bicycles up and down narrow freight elevators cost time and money. However, the plant was also the beating heart of the brand. The workforce consisted of highly skilled laborers, many of whom were second or third generation employees. They possessed decades of institutional knowledge regarding the proprietary electro-forging process. They took immense pride in their work, knowing that the bicycles they welded and painted were considered the gold standard of American childhood. But as the 1970s came to a close, inflation skyrocketed across the United States. The cost of living squeezed the working class, and the factory employees demanded better wages and updated benefits. Edward Jr. and his executive board flatly refused. They looked at the outdated Chicago plant and saw only a massive financial liability. The executives believed that the workers were entirely replaceable and that the union was an obstacle to profitability. The tension between the boardroom and the factory floor escalated rapidly. Management demanded severe concessions, essentially asking the workforce to pay for the strategic blunders the executives had made regarding the adult bicycle market. The workers felt betrayed by a family they had served for nearly a century. The breaking point arrived in the fall of 1980. Contract negotiations collapsed completely, and the workforce voted to walk out. For the first time since the Great Depression, the massive Chicago factory fell completely silent. The roar of the stamping presses stopped. The welding sparks faded into darkness. Over 1,000 workers formed picket lines on the sidewalks outside the brick walls, holding signs and demanding a fair contract. The strike lasted for a grueling 13 weeks. During this time, the carefully constructed distribution monopoly began to tear itself apart. Authorized dealers across the country, who were strictly forbidden from selling rival brands, suddenly found themselves with empty showrooms right before the crucial holiday shopping season. They flooded the corporate headquarters with angry phone calls, begging for inventory to keep their own small businesses alive. To survive the shutdown, Edward Jr. made a calculated and ultimately fatal decision. Instead of returning to the negotiating table to end the strike, he ramped up the importation of Japanese bicycles. The foreign shipments kept the company afloat and provided the dealers with just enough inventory to survive the winter. But this short-term survival tactic taught the executives a very dangerous lesson. They realized that the company could still generate revenue even if their own factory was completely shut down. The executives took the strike as a deep personal insult, and they decided to retaliate with absolute cruelty. When the exhausted workers finally returned to the assembly lines early the next year, the war was already lost. Management had secretly decided that they would no longer tolerate organized labor. They began a systematic plan to permanently dismantle their domestic manufacturing capabilities. They started shifting production to a non-union facility in the Deep South and accelerated their reliance on Asian suppliers. Shortly after, the company announced the permanent closure of the historic Chicago plant. The executives voluntarily tore up the roots of their own empire to punish their workforce and save a fraction on labor costs. They threw thousands of loyal craftsmen into the street, completely severing the company from the physical act of building the very product that carried their name. Chapter 7. Missing the Revolutions. The irony of the 1970s and 1980s bicycle revolutions is that they were built directly on the bones of old Schwinn frames. While the executives in Chicago were fighting a bitter war with their union and struggling to import lightweight 10 speeds, an entirely new culture of cycling was being born on the dirt trails of California. It started with the kids. In the vacant lots and dirt tracks of Southern California, teenagers were taking their old Stingrays, stripping off the heavy fenders, changing the tires, and racing them over jumps. They were mimicking the motorcycle riders they saw on television. This grassroots movement became known as bicycle motocross, or BMX. Because Schwinn frames were welded from heavy steel, they were the only bikes that could survive the brutal landings. The kids were essentially doing the research and development for the company for free. A few years later, a similar rebellion happened in Northern California. On the steep, rocky fire roads of Marin County, a group of rebellious adult cyclists grew bored with riding thin-tire bicycles on paved roads. Men like Gary Fisher and Joe Breeze started hauling heavy, single-speed bicycles to the top of Mount Tamalpais and racing them downhill. They needed frames that would not snap in half under the immense stress of a mountain descent. They scoured junkyards and thrift stores, specifically looking for old Schwinn Excelsiors from the 1930s. Those heavy balloon tire cruisers, the exact same models that F.W. Schwinn had designed to save the company during the Great Depression, became the foundation of the very first mountain bikes. They added heavy-duty brakes and multiple gears, creating a completely new machine. Schwinn was sitting on a gold mine. The two biggest bicycle movements of the late 20th century were literally built using their old products. The market was screaming at them, showing them exactly what the next generation of riders wanted. But the response from the corporate headquarters in Chicago was staggering in its arrogance. When regional sales representatives from California called the engineers to report on the exploding BMX and mountain bike trends, the executives dismissed them entirely. The men running the company were traditionalists who wore suits to the office. To them, bicycles belonged strictly on paved roads. They viewed the dirt track kids and the Marin County downhill racers as an unruly fringe element. The engineering department formally mocked the concept of a mountain bike, calling it an absurd West Coast fad that would never appeal to mainstream America. This dismissal proved to be a fatal miscalculation. Small, hungry startups recognized the massive potential that the old giant ignored. Companies like Mongoose and Diamondback swooped in to capture the booming BMX market, building specialized bikes that were lighter and stronger than modified Stingrays. Meanwhile, a young company named Specialized took the mountain bike concept, refined it, and mass-produced the Stump Jumper. Within a few short years, the mountain bike went from a localized California hobby to a multi-billion-dollar global industry. It completely revolutionized the way people rode bicycles, shifting the entire market away from road bikes and toward off-road capability. By the time Schwinn management finally realized their mistake, it was far too late. They hastily tried to enter both markets, but their initial offerings were heavy, poorly designed, and lacked any authentic connection to the riding culture. The kids racing on dirt tracks and the adults climbing mountains looked at the new Schwinn models and saw an out-of-touch corporation trying to cash in on a trend they did not understand. The brand that had once defined American youth was suddenly viewed as a dinosaur. They had surrendered the future of the industry to a fleet of aggressive new competitors. The fortress walls were not just cracking anymore. The foundation had been completely bypassed. Desperate to regain their lost market share and still reeling from the permanent closure of their Chicago plant, the leadership prepared to make a desperate move. They looked overseas for salvation, ready to hand over their most valuable assets to anyone who could build bicycles cheaper and faster. Chapter 8. A Deal in the East. The permanent closure of the Chicago factory left Schwinn in a deeply precarious position. For nearly a century, the physical act of building bicycles was the absolute core of their identity. Now, they were a bicycle company without a primary manufacturing hub. Management had successfully crushed the union, but they still needed to put products on showroom floors. To fill the massive void left by their own dismantled assembly lines, Edward Schwinn Jr. and his executive team looked across the Pacific. They needed a partner who could produce high volumes of bicycles at a fraction of the American labor cost. In the late 1970s, Taiwan was rapidly developing into a global manufacturing center, though it was largely known for producing cheap, low-quality goods. During a scouting trip, Schwinn executives visited a relatively small, obscure bicycle factory named Giant Manufacturing. At the time, Giant was a modest operation. They had ambition, but lacked the advanced engineering knowledge and strict quality control protocols required to build premium bicycles for the American market. The executives from Chicago saw a blank canvas. They saw a factory with incredibly cheap labor that could be molded to serve their exact needs. What followed was one of the most consequential transfers of intellectual property in the history of American manufacturing. Schwinn did not just hand Giant a contract, they handed them the keys to the kingdom. The American company sent its best remaining engineers to Taiwan to train the Giant workforce. They provided decades' worth of proprietary technical drawings, precise geometric formulas, and metallurgical standards. They taught the Taiwanese factory how to source the best components, how to weld lightweight frames properly, and how to implement rigorous quality control systems. In essence, Schwinn built a world-class manufacturing facility overseas entirely at their own expense. The arrangement seemed like a stroke of absolute corporate genius at first. By the early 1980s, the shipments of Giant-built bicycles arrived in the United States bearing the famous Schwinn head badge. The quality was surprisingly excellent. Because Giant was using Schwinn engineering and premium components, the bicycles rode beautifully. The authorized dealers, who had spent years begging for lightweight models to compete with European imports, were finally thrilled to have inventory they could sell. More importantly, for the boardroom in Chicago, the profit margins were spectacular. The cost to produce a bicycle in Taiwan was a mere fraction of what it had cost in the unionized Chicago plant. For a brief, intoxicating period, the company's balance sheets looked incredibly healthy. Edward Jr. was hailed as a modernizing visionary who had successfully transitioned an aging industrial dinosaur into a sleek, profitable marketing machine. But this short-term financial victory masked a fatal strategic error. The executives in Chicago failed to realize the true cost of their new business model. By teaching Giant exactly how to build a world-class bicycle, Schwinn surrendered its only real competitive advantage. They willingly gave away the deep institutional knowledge that Ignaz and F.W. Schwinn had spent their entire lives cultivating. The American executives treated Giant like a subordinate vendor, assuming the Taiwanese factory would simply remain a quiet, obedient supplier forever. They did not anticipate that their new partner possessed its own massive ambitions. Within a few years, Giant was manufacturing hundreds of thousands of bicycles exclusively for Schwinn. The Taiwanese plant soon represented nearly 80% of the American brand's total inventory. The historic power dynamic had completely flipped. The famous Chicago company was no longer an independent manufacturer dictating terms to the market. They were now entirely dependent on a single foreign factory for their absolute survival. If Giant stopped shipping frames, Schwinn had no product to sell. They had traded their manufacturing independence for cheap labor and higher profit margins. The soul of the company had been fundamentally hollowed out. A Schwinn bicycle was no longer a symbol of American industrial might, forged in the fires of the Midwest. It was an imported commodity, designed by accountants and built by contractors. The brand name still commanded respect among consumers, but behind the scenes, the empire was merely a fragile shell. They had made a pact with the devil, sacrificing their heritage for immediate financial relief. The obscure Taiwanese factory they had so generously educated was rapidly realizing that they no longer needed the famous American brand to sell bicycles. Chapter 9. The student surpasses the teacher. The executives at the Chicago headquarters assumed their relationship with Giant Manufacturing would remain permanently one-sided. They viewed the Taiwanese factory strictly as a piece of hired machinery, a convenient tool to produce bicycles cheaply, while the American executives focused on marketing and corporate strategy. This perspective was a fatal misjudgment of ambition. The leadership at Giant, spearheaded by King Liu and Tony Lowe, were not content to simply remain an anonymous subcontractor forever. They were brilliant, hungry, and highly observant. They absorbed every single piece of engineering knowledge, manufacturing technique, and quality control standard that the American engineers had brought over. They learned how to build world-class bicycles, and then they asked themselves a very dangerous question. If the Taiwanese factory was doing all of the actual manufacturing, what exactly was the American company contributing to the relationship besides a historic logo? The answer to that question fundamentally changed the global bicycle industry. By the early 1980s, Giant had mastered the production process so completely that their manufacturing capabilities matched and soon exceeded those of their American mentors. They realized they no longer needed a middleman. In 1981, Giant took a massive strategic step and launched their own independent bicycle brand. They started cautiously, testing the waters by exporting their own branded bicycles to Europe. The response was incredibly positive. The quality was undeniable, directly rivaling the premium European brands but costing significantly less. Emboldened by this initial success, Giant prepared to bring the fight directly to their biggest client. They set their sights on the United States market. When Giant officially entered the American retail landscape in the late 1980s, they deployed a highly aggressive strategy. They bypassed the department stores and went straight to the independent bicycle shops. These were the exact same local dealers that had been under the strict, heavy-handed control of the Chicago headquarters for decades. Giant offered these dealers a deeply compelling proposition. They provided bicycles that were fundamentally identical in quality and geometry to the American models because they were built on the exact same assembly lines. However, because Giant did not have the massive corporate overhead of the Chicago headquarters, they could offer these bicycles at a significantly lower wholesale price. The independent dealers, many of whom were still bitter about the lack of domestic production and tired of rigid corporate rules, quickly realized they could make much higher profit margins selling a Giant bicycle instead of a Schwinn. The American executives were entirely blindsided. They suddenly found themselves in a vicious price war against a competitor who possessed their own engineering blueprints and controlled their entire supply chain. The power dynamic shifted rapidly and brutally. As Giant focused on expanding its own brand footprint across the United States, the Taiwanese factory floor naturally began to prioritize its own products. When production capacity grew tight, or when shipping containers were in short supply, Giant ensured that their own branded bicycles were completed and shipped first. The American orders were routinely delayed. Showrooms back in the United States found themselves waiting anxiously for inventory that was constantly arriving late, causing dealers to lose critical sales during peak summer seasons. Edward Schwinn Jr. and his board of directors were completely paralyzed. In a normal business relationship, a company would simply fire an insubordinate supplier and move their production elsewhere. But Schwinn could not fire Giant. They had no backup plan. Having permanently shuttered their own Chicago manufacturing plant and dismantled their domestic supply network, they were entirely captive to the Taiwanese factory. They had willingly handed over their technology, their manufacturing secrets, and their future to cut costs. Now they were forced to sit back and watch helplessly as their own student systematically strangled them in their home market. The proud American empire was slowly bleeding to death, unable to manufacture its own goods, and outmaneuvered by the very foreign partner it had created. The stage was set for a final, humiliating collapse that would erase a century of industrial legacy. Chapter 10. The End of the Line. By the dawn of the 1990s, the financial reality inside the corporate headquarters was no longer something that could be hidden by aggressive marketing or historical prestige. The American bicycle market was expanding rapidly, driven largely by the massive popularity of mountain bikes. Yet, the company that had essentially provided the blueprint for this movement was bleeding money at an astonishing rate. Schwinn was losing market share daily to younger, more agile competitors who understood modern materials like lightweight aluminum and carbon fiber. Furthermore, the Taiwanese factory they had trained, Giant, was now a dominant force in the global market, actively undercutting their former mentors at every turn. The revenue streams that had sustained the Chicago empire for decades were drying up, leaving behind a mountain of corporate debt. Edward Schwinn Jr. and his executive team tried frantically to stop the bleeding. They attempted to restructure their operations and acquire new manufacturing facilities, including a desperate and ill-fated purchase of a bicycle plant in Hungary. But these efforts were disorganized, severely underfunded, and ultimately far too late. The structural damage inflicted upon the company during the 1980s was simply too profound. They had abandoned their domestic manufacturing base, alienated their fiercely loyal network of independent dealers, and completely missed the biggest technological shifts in their industry. The bank loans came due, and the corporate accounts were completely exhausted. The math was final and unforgiving. In late 1992, almost a century after Ignaz Schwinn opened his first modest workshop in Chicago, the most famous bicycle company in American history officially filed for bankruptcy. The news sent a shockwave through the manufacturing world. For generations of Americans, the name on the head badge was synonymous with indestructible quality and the pure joy of childhood. To see that name listed on bankruptcy documents felt like watching a permanent piece of American culture quietly evaporate. The financial collapse meant the absolute end of an era. The Schwinn family, who had tightly controlled the business through 4 distinct generations, was entirely stripped of their power and ousted from the boardroom. Their legacy was suddenly placed on the auction block, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder, to satisfy angry creditors. The subsequent years were a humiliating downward spiral for the once proud brand. The company was purchased by an investment group, which later sold it to another corporation. It bounced between various financial portfolios and multinational conglomerates. Each new owner stripped away a little more of the original identity, treating the historic name strictly as a licensing tool rather than a standard of manufacturing excellence. The final devastating blow to the brand prestige occurred when the new corporate owners abandoned the authorized dealer network completely. They took the famous logo and slapped it onto cheaply made, heavy, mass-produced bicycles destined for the aisles of massive discount department stores. This was the exact retail environment that F.W. Schwinn had fought so aggressively to avoid during the 1950s. He knew that selling cheap products in big box stores would instantly destroy the premium reputation of the company. Decades later, his worst fears were entirely realized. The bicycles sitting under the fluorescent lights of modern supermarkets bore the iconic Starburst logo, but they contained absolutely none of the engineering brilliance or durable craftsmanship that had built the empire. They were ghost ships, carrying a legendary name, but completely hollow inside. The story of this massive industrial collapse is a profound warning for any business empire. It proves that no amount of historical success can protect a company from the lethal combination of corporate arrogance and a refusal to adapt. They survived the Great Depression by understanding exactly what their customers needed. They dominated the post-war boom by maintaining uncompromising quality and controlling their distribution. But when the market shifted, the leadership became distracted. They chose the easy path of outsourcing instead of the difficult work of modernization. They fought their own workers instead of fighting their competitors. In the end, they did not lose because people stopped riding bicycles. They lost because they forgot how to be a bicycle company. The massive brick factories are gone, the assembly lines are silent, and the empire is only a memory, serving as a bitter reminder of how quickly a century of greatness can be quietly thrown away.